So Obi-Wan Kenobi came and went, and if I had to use one word to describe the Disney Plus show, it would have to be lazy. If I had to use another word to describe it, it would be contrived, and it really saddens me to say that. I was legitimately looking forward to Kenobi. Ewan McGregor was my favourite part of the prequel trilogy. Obi-Wan is one of my favourite Star Wars characters, and the time period that this show is set in, the years straight after Order 66, is also one of the most interesting ones in Star Wars to me. So it really bums me out to say it was a really weak and at times just outright lazy show, with not too many redeeming traits. The story doesn't really fit with the original trilogy canon, and even worse still, it kind of blows the really interesting prospect of exploring Obi-Wan's character post-Order 66. And that's the biggest problem I have with it really. The series had real potential that was just kind of squandered by some really silly choices and lazy storytelling. The direction in this show is really all over the place. The best thing I can say about the direction is that at best it just feels generic, and for a show set in the Star Wars universe, being generic is probably one of the worst things you can be. At the other end of the scale, the worst thing I can say about the direction is at times it feels really incompetent and really quite amateurish. The visuals just have this flat and kind of static feeling to them. It's got no life. Episode 1 encapsulates this issue really well. We get introduced to the Inquisitors. This should be a big deal. It's setting up some new big bads, but there's just no menace or threat to these guys because of the way it's filmed. The scene opens in broad daylight and the characters just sort of walk on, and it's just so dead and uninteresting. The lighting isn't doing these characters any favors either. This is the opposite of cinematic storytelling. We get to see some different locations in Kenobi, which is nice for a change, but this issue with direction and how the show looks visually doesn't change from location to location either. Episode 2, Kenobi heads to Daiyu, and this was a really good chance to show off a new city location at night, but everything just feels really uninspired about it. For one, it feels like a small movie set stage, and it feels so generic. This could be any other futuristic city from any other show. And this isn't a problem for the other Star Wars shows or even the Disney Plus shows. When you watch The Mandalorian, it feels like a short movie every week, but with Kenobi, the whole thing just kind of feels like a cheap television show. It feels like something the Sci-Fi Channel would put out, like one of their original movies or one of their original shows. Everything is filmed in this flat and static style that does nothing to really hold your attention, and this problem with direction is something that really dogs Kenobi across the entire 6-episode run. In episode 3, Vader shows up, and this scene should be a way bigger deal than it ends up being. This is Vader we're talking about here, and honestly it feels like it could be anyone. This is the first time Kenobi is actually laying eyes on his old friend in the Vader suit, but there's no tension or anticipation to this scene at all. I was really looking forward to seeing how Kenobi would react to seeing his old friend in the suit, but I was just bored throughout the whole thing. This is the first meeting between these two guys since Revenge of the Sith. This reunion needs to be way more impactful than this. This is probably the best example of how the direction of the show took a scene that should have been great and just squandered the potential of it. Take this scene from Star Wars Rebels, where Ahsoka finds out that Vader is Anakin, the guy who trained her old mentor. This one scene does such a great job of showing you how a character, in this case Ahsoka, is impacted by seeing her old friend and what he has become. Just from seeing her eye dilate, you can tell she's just recognized her old friend is the guy she's now fighting with. When you watch this scene, you actually feel something. You remember this scene later on. I've rewatched it a few times on YouTube. I just love it, and you can see the shock and horror of the realization hit her just by seeing her eye dilate. But in Kenobi, we don't get anything that even approaches this scene from Rebels. Vader just walks out, starts choking some bystanders while Kenobi watches from afar. There's no emotional weight to it. I feel like Kenobi could be watching the Grand Inquisitor do all this and his reaction would be the exact same. If you want to see how to make a really compelling intro for Vader, take a look at this scene from Jedi Fallen Order. This game really bigs up Vader. He feels powerful and intimidating here. When Kenobi and Vader finally get down to it, the whole fight occurs in this really dull setting, in what looks like a quarry at night time. And to be honest, it's kind of really difficult to tell exactly where they are. One thing I thought this show would actually deliver in spades was the action. The prequels went all in on the whole fast choreographed lightsaber combat, but here it's just kind of dull. There's nothing memorable about it, there's no emotional punch to seeing these two fighting each other. It's uninspired, and again, these are really big moments, but there's nothing memorable about them. Across the entire 6 episodes, there's only 1 or 2 scenes maybe, and those are in the final episodes, that are worth a rewatch, that actually have some emotional punch to them. And what a shame that is. This show in particular should not have had this problem. They've got McGregor, they've got Christensen back again. The first reunion between these two guys since Revenge of the Sith, and a few weeks after watching it, I can barely remember anything that even comes close to interesting or memorable about it. I said at the start of this video that the direction for this show at worst was incompetent. Now look, I'm not one of those reviewer channels that literally goes through a show or a film literally frame by frame looking for mistakes, but man, there are some really obvious ones in Kenobi, like glaringly obvious. I can't really talk about this show without mentioning some of these scenes. And you know the scenes I'm talking about. These two guys come up on either side of Leia here, but no one thinks it's a good idea to box her in here on the right. You know, the glaringly obvious area that isn't covered. Here these goons are just obviously falling over themselves trying to capture her. I mean, this guy runs into a tree. I know the first episode is light in action, and maybe the idea behind this scene was to give some pop to the final few minutes of the episode, but man, come on, if your choice is using this footage or not using it, just don't use it. Or just get a better take. You must have gotten a better take than this on the day. I cannot believe this is the best take the director decided to go with. This is some low effort stuff, man. This is first take material. Here's another of Kenobi obviously letting Leia go. Here's another from episode 3. Kenobi is stuck at a security checkpoint with Leia. Once he manages to cut down security, he's in a hurry to leave, so he blasts the controls on the laser barrier. But he could just walk around it easily. This fence is just to stop vehicles. And it's mistakes like this that make the whole production just seem really, really lazy. Like, these are the kinds of mistakes you'd see in some low budget horror films or even fan films. And the odd thing is that I'm really only seeing this issue in this show. The Book of Boba Fett and The Mandalorian don't have obvious issues like this. As an example, this scene with the security outpost, someone would have had to have seen this issue with the gap right here. Someone could have just taken out the establishing and closing shots of this scene and the audience never would have been any the wiser. I mean, if I noticed this my first time in a single viewing, someone in production could have easily have seen it. This isn't just clumsy, it's outright lazy. You're literally handing critics and internet reviewers easy shots with this kind of thing. The first time I saw this, I thought if someone had spent more than 5 minutes on this scene in editing, they would have caught this. But then I thought, shit, this mistake should never even have made it as far as editing. This fence is literally in the establishing and closing shots of this scene. This could not in any way have been missed by the director on site that day. It's small things like this that just let you know the whole series was just rushed through development. Like, this scene was just filmed once, viewed once, then edited together in one pass. I've taken a lot of shots at the direction of Kenobi, but the direction isn't actually the show's biggest problem. The writing for Kenobi is easily its biggest problem. The whole story is just shot through with plot contrivances, weak and ill-defined characterizations, weak plotting, and nonsensical character motivations. Kenobi is keeping a watchful eye over Luke, right? That's his main mission now on Tatooine. So then why has he buried his lightsaber in the middle of the desert? Won't he need that to protect Luke if a Trek comes along? And also, why hasn't he been training all this time? I mean, wouldn't he need to be ready for trouble at any moment, just in case someone did come for Luke? Wouldn't he need to be keeping his Jedi Force abilities primed? I mean, he could have been suffering from something like PTSD from the fallout of everything that happened in Revenge of the Sith, but I don't think that's the case here. And if it is the case, the writers don't do a really good job of getting that across to the audience. At first I thought he was just cutting himself off from everything related to the Jedi Order, his training, his weapon, all of that. But then him cutting himself off from everything related to the Jedi doesn't really make any sense either, since he's invested in protecting Luke. He even mentions that the boy will need to be trained at some point, and he's also trying to reach out to Qui-Gon throughout the entire show. Honestly, I don't really get what the writers were going for here with Kenobi. It's not clear. And you'll see this kind of problem with Reva and other characters too. Reva's whole motivation throughout the show is revenge. She wants to get close enough to Vader to kill him for killing her friends at the Jedi Temple. That's easy enough to follow, right? But the thing is, she became a Grand Inquisitor to get close to him. She's done some really monstrous things herself. I guess the writers were going for the whole revenge just makes you as bad as the person you're after, but this doesn't really work for Reva. Reva has no problem cutting down anyone who crosses her path. That can be innocent people who just get in her way, Sith Inquisitors, it doesn't matter. She cuts a woman's hand off for basically nothing, and threatens to kill Owen Lars and his family to get information on where Kenobi is. She's about to torture Leia before Kenobi rescues her. She's as bad as Vader in her own way. She has zero value for life, so it's kind of difficult to empathize with her when you hear her tragic backstory in episode 5, when you've seen her mow down and maim people pretty indiscriminately for the last 5 episodes. It's just a really strange characterization to go with. You could have probably made Reva someone who wasn't an Inquisitor, and her character would have made a lot more sense. Maybe just someone like a Jedi Padawan who was tracking Vader for years trying to kill him. Honestly, this story and a lot of the character work feels like at best a first pass of a script. I kept getting this feeling when I was watching Kenobi that events in the show were just happening to move the plot along. Like take episode 5, which is probably one of the worst episodes for this. Reva pulls her double cross on Vader and tries to bury her lightsaber in his back, but Vader's already figured out what she's doing. The two of them get into it for a bit. Vader gets the upper hand and sticks her with her own lightsaber. Then, the Grand Inquisitor, who we thought was dead at the end of episode 2, shows up, and both he and Vader decide for some reason it's just a better idea right now not to kill Reva right here. And before they both leave, the Grand Inquisitor drops this line to Reva.
Revenge does wonders for the will to live, don't...
This line and its usage in this scene literally makes no sense. Reva's whole character is motivated by revenge. You both know this, and also, she almost has exactly the same wound she gave you earlier on, and you're fine, you're walking around. I mean, this wouldn't even be the first time that Reva survived this kind of mortal injury. She survived it before when she was like 7. I'm sure she's only stronger now. This scene is contradicting itself. The Grand Inquisitor himself is pointing out exactly why he shouldn't be letting her live. He knows from his own personal experience that someone can come back from this kind of injury, and they can come back from it by leaning into their revenge and hatred. You know, the two things that Reva has an abundance of. It's honestly like he's trying to spur her on to come back. I mean, wouldn't it just be smarter to finish her here, take her off the board entirely, just in case she comes back at you? She has a history of coming back from this kind of thing. The Grand Inquisitor has literally no valid reason to let Reva live, and Vader has even less reason to let Reva live. And also, Vader should just kill Reva on principle. I mean, she was moving against him this entire time. She's a traitor, and she just tried to kill you. It's usually not a good idea if you're a person in power to just let someone who was just a few minutes ago trying to stab you in the back go free. I know she's just been stabbed for her trouble, but usually you want to make an example of people that try to end you. When I would see something inorganic like this, I'd just go, okay, right, this is happening now because the writers need to get Reva to the last episode for the showdown. That's how you know the writing is contrived, because you can't understand why a character is doing something that they obviously shouldn't be doing, but the story requires them to start acting out of character to move the plot along. Not that you need another example, but in episode 5 again, Obi-Wan receives a message from Bail Organa on his communicator. He goes to a quiet spot to have a listen, you know, because the information is pretty sensitive, he doesn't want just anyone to overhear it. Fast forward a few minutes later, and Kenobi is just handing that same communicator off to Camille Nanjiani's character, who then accidentally drops it, only for it to be picked up by Reva as she's bleeding out. Reva needs to know about Luke for the showdown, and her hearing this message gets her to that point. Why didn't Kenobi just delete this message? The information is pretty sensitive. He's listened to it, he doesn't need it anymore. But a few minutes later he's just handing this communicator with all this sensitive information over to someone he barely knows. There's an example of that contrived writing again, inorganically moving the plot forward. And things like this are really common in Kenobi. It's not just only the over-reliance on plot contrivances, there's also scenes that just straight up don't make any sense. I've heard some people say that episode 5 was where the show started to turn around, but for me it was one of the episodes where the writing was at its most lazy. Episode 5, again. The Empire comes in to capture Kenobi on Jabim, and they just start shelling the Resistance stronghold's door with one cannon. And I mean, don't you have something better than this, or maybe even just another cannon? This ends up not mattering anyway because a few minutes later, Reva, out of nowhere, just goes right ahead and cuts straight through the door with her lightsaber, no problem. I mean, why didn't she just do that from the start? And again, I'm not trying to nitpick this stuff, but Reva just cutting straight through the door totally invalidates the earlier scenes of her men slowly blasting the door down. When I see a mistake like this, I just think there is no way that the writers reviewing the script didn't catch this. This is lazy writing. Here's another few examples also from episode 5. Reva openly discusses a plan to work with Kenobi in earshot of her men. It's like the scriptwriters just forgot that Reva wasn't alone on this mission and she actually had a whole bunch of stormtroopers around her. I honestly think this scene between Reva and Obi-Wan was meant to occur on one of these ships over here, but for whatever reason, let's just say some production issue came up, or the scene had to be rewritten, or whatever. So instead of using one of these ships, the scene was changed to this location, but the writers or the production crew never accounted for how this scene would play out when these two characters were literally surrounded by stormtroopers. Here's another example. How would Reva be able to explain that it was a smarter move to move a captured Kenobi closer to where the rebels were and not, say, to one of these ships right here? I know she's working against Vader here, and she's in charge so no one's questioning her orders, but this decision makes no sense to anyone that isn't in on this plan with Reva. We get some backstory for Reva in this same episode, and it just doesn't work at all, primarily because what Reva's describing isn't really matching up with what we're seeing as the audience. Reva mentions that she hid with the bodies of her dead friends so Vader didn't kill her, but I'm not sure how that plan would work though if you've already been stabbed. I mean, it feels like this scene was written differently from how it was filmed. Like originally maybe Reva hid under the bodies and that's why Vader missed her, but in the final product, Reva gets run straight through by Anakin's lightsaber. So I'm not sure how hiding in the bodies of her classmates immediately after getting stabbed would save her. Hiding with the bodies of her friends seems like something you do in the first place to avoid being stabbed. What Reva is telling us doesn't line up with what we're seeing. The whole scene makes me think that this was just some last minute reshoot, or the writers are referencing an earlier version of the script where this scene played out differently. Originally, Reva probably saw Anakin killing her friends and she was hiding and was never actually stabbed by him, but for whatever reason, the writers never updated the dialogue to match what was occurring in the final draft. Look, I hate this nitpicking bullshit, but these aren't even really nitpicks, they're plot holes at this stage. I don't like highlighting minor mistakes, but here these mistakes are so glaring and so obvious that I just can't believe they were missed, and I don't think they actually were missed either. These mistakes were left in because to fix them would mean that more reshoots were required, and I'm guessing there just wasn't time for that. This is a production that must have been rushing like crazy to get this show over the line, and quality was just an afterthought. The last episode is a pretty mixed bag. There's some decent stuff in there, it's the best episode of the show's run, but that's not really saying much. And like all the other episodes, there's a ton of lazy writing, inconsistent story logic, and characters acting, well, very out of character. The end fight is the best action in the show, full stop. There's some nice choreography in there, and the scene with Anakin and Obi-Wan works surprisingly well. I like that when Vader's mask is destroyed, his voice is a mix between James Earl Jones and Hayden Christensen's. But what doesn't work though is Obi-Wan leaving Vader alive. I mean, I could understand him sparing him if he felt that Vader still had some good left in him, but he leaves knowing that Vader is beyond help at this point. I mean, if Vader is just pure evil now, and there is nothing of his old friend left in there, wouldn't that alone be enough reason for Obi-Wan to kill him? I mean, what was the whole point of luring Vader to this planet, if not to kill him in the first place? Kenobi even says he'll do what he needs to end this before going to take him on. This fight can only go really one of two directions. 1. Kenobi spares him because he feels his friend can still be saved. 2. The fight ends because the two of them get separated somehow before Kenobi can kill him. The writers opted for a third option that made zero sense. Kenobi didn't learn anything from talking with Vader that would have prevented him from killing him. I mean, let's say there's another scene in this episode where Obi-Wan is talking with Bail Organa after he just had the showdown with Vader. How would Kenobi respond to the question, "Why didn't you kill Vader? What did you learn from him that made you change your mind about killing him?" What could Kenobi actually respond with that would make that decision make sense? The answer is nothing. There is no answer that Kenobi could give that makes that decision okay. Leaving Vader alive makes Obi-Wan responsible for all the horrible things that Vader will go on to do. There were smarter options on the table that would have made way more sense to go with, but the writers, for whatever reason, decided to go with an idea that literally contradicts their own story and makes the primary character of the show come off looking way worse. This show doesn't do Kenobi's character any favors. I will never be okay with Kenobi just running away from Vader like he does in episode 3. I know this scene is being used to set up Vader and show him off as a kind of almost horror-style villain, but it's done totally at the expense of Kenobi's character. Kenobi would never run away like this. As a guy who's watched all of the Clone Wars, this is not something Kenobi has ever done. I mean, you could also say that Kenobi is leading Vader away from Leia, but it doesn't really look like that from the way that it's shot. And you see Kenobi do a bunch of things that are just really out of character for him in this show, like just accidentally giving away Leia's name. It just feels more natural for Leia to make a mistake like this. She's 9 years old, but for some reason the writers wanted Kenobi to drop the ball and almost get both of them killed. It makes him look incompetent. The Star Wars fans will show up for anything, myself included, but when the end product is this lazy, they tend to notice, and the review scores for the show have reflected that. I know people love to trot out this line that the fans are entitled and they expect too much, but man, they really do deserve better than this. When you turn out a show that is this poor, you really are just kind of showing the fans how important you think this whole thing is. Disney really shouldn't think that just pushing out some low effort content like this and slapping the Star Wars name on it will keep the fans happy. Sony thought that just putting out a sloppy film with at best tangential links to Spider-Man would be enough to bring the fans in, but no man, they tore Morbius to pieces, and Kenobi got that same treatment online. And what's most telling about how Kenobi was received by the fans is there isn't even a vocal group of Star Wars fans rushing to defend it. A few weeks after the finale, no one is really talking about Kenobi, and those that are just saying that it was a really poor show. It doesn't have the controversy around it that The Last Jedi had. It's like people just universally didn't like it and have already forgotten about it. Star Wars is in a pretty precarious situation right now. The films are pretty much on hold, and outside of The Mandalorian and Clone Wars Season 7, Disney haven't really managed to deliver a hit for Star Wars on the small screen. After the Book of Boba Fett, and now Kenobi 2, the future of the Disney Plus Star Wars shows is on pretty shaky ground. A point I think will come where the fans will eventually tune out if they feel the quality is just not there anymore. This series should have easily been a slam dunk. They got the original cast back, the hype around it was huge, but the whole thing just feels totally underwhelming and at times really cynical. I was looking through Twitter before writing this review to get an idea of the overall consensus of how the fans felt about the show, and I found one poster who summed it up really well. He simply said, "This show is just a bad product." And yeah, that's exactly what the show feels like, a product. Just put out there to fill a demand with no creative drive or real integrity behind it. It's a product, and a pretty poor one at that. Outside of all the issues I've had with Kenobi, its direction, its story, its production design, out of all of that, the biggest problem I have with it is that it just doesn't do anything with the premise. For me, Kenobi had the most potential of all the Disney Plus Star Wars shows. The writers could have done so much with Kenobi post Order 66. They could have busted out that de-aging technology they've got and given us some flashbacks to Anakin and Kenobi fighting in the Clone Wars together, showing them as friends, expanding and deepening their relationship. They could have shown Kenobi really trying to pull his friend back to the light again and it tearing him up when he couldn't do it. They could have shown Kenobi really mourning the loss of Anakin and all of his friends in the Jedi Order who were murdered. These ideas seem like the really obvious stuff the writers should have focused on in a show about Kenobi. And I'm not salty because the writers didn't do what I personally wanted them to do. Hell, I'm not salty that the writers decided to take the character in another direction. No, I'm annoyed because the writers really didn't do anything at all with Kenobi. All the good ideas the writers could have explored were essentially replaced with nothing. For all of Disney's hype, the writers really didn't do anything with Hayden back in the role as Vader. Outside of the flashback sequence, which is one of the best parts of the series, this guy has negligible screen time. It would have been nice to see Hayden in the suit more, maybe explore him kind of going through some mental conflict. Maybe he's conflicted almost 10 years into the role of Vader. Maybe he's kind of tempted by the light side, and maybe his final confrontation with Kenobi makes him fully embrace the dark side somehow. You know, give him an arc. But no, we don't get any new angle on Vader as a character. We don't get to explore any interesting ideas in this show. The only character that comes close to having an arc in this show was Reva. I can understand what the writers were going for with her, it's a redemption arc. But with Kenobi, he's more happy at the end for sure than he was at the start. But why he's more happy? I honestly couldn't tell you. What I wanted from this show was something that really explored the fallout from Revenge of the Sith, and to see how Obi-Wan is handling that 10 years later. The same with Vader too. I wanted to see more exploration of his character, but instead we didn't get any of that. We got a pretty dull and generic sci-fi show that blew the massive potential of its own premise through a combination of lazy writing and rushed development. Not to let this review end on a total downer, I hate reviews where I don't really have much positive stuff to say about a movie or TV show. I have some recommendations which I'm sure you're all just dying to hear. All of you. Season 2 looks like it's going to happen, and that kind of annoys me because, like with the sequel trilogy, there was obviously no plan in place for Kenobi Season 2 from the start. Now that the writers have gone and blown what is potentially their biggest story, the reunion between Kenobi and Vader, What's the next big move? Kind of seems like maybe the writer should have built up to that confrontation instead of just rushing it in the finale of this series. But having said that, I think there is potential for more live-action Kenobi stories, but just not with the same people in charge. This production was siloed away from Favreau and Filoni, and it really shows. If there is a season 2, bring in Favreau and Filoni and scale the whole thing back. Just focus on the character of Kenobi. A few years back I read the John Jackson Miller Kenobi novel, and what I really loved about that book was how it didn't have world-ending stakes. A lot of it was just focusing on Kenobi and how he was handling everything after Revenge of the Sith, how he was adapting to life on Tatooine, and how he could protect Luke and his family from Tusken Raiders. This book really felt true to Kenobi's character. Maybe adapt some parts of that book, or failing that, maybe adapt some parts of the original Kenobi movie script. I haven't read it, but there were some pretty interesting ideas in there from what I've heard, like Kenobi and Commander Cody working together on Tatooine. I love this idea, not just because I love the Clone Wars show, but it actually solves a problem too. It allows Kenobi to leave Tatooine without leaving Luke totally defenseless, like he does in this show. From the script it sounded like Kenobi and Cody would have been bickering a lot with each other. Cody would have also had to deal with the guilt he felt from all the things he had to do during Order 66. I mean, there's a lot of potential for a great story right there. You could have Kenobi going through an arc where he has to learn to trust the next stormtrooper. Watching these guys working together towards the common goal of protecting Luke, that's interesting. Hayden Christensen is back for Ahsoka, and hopefully Ewan McGregor too, so maybe Ahsoka will be able to capitalize on the missed opportunities of this show and deliver on some of the potential that this show had. We can only hope. As always, thanks for watching.